let's say for the sake of argument that you really wanted to play a fairy deck, and let's also say, with maybe one layer added to the argument, you liked the idea of lots and lots of fairy tokens and playing as much on your opponent's turns as you were playing on your own turn. Well, if that's the kind of person you are, then I think I might have the deck for you. This is Alayla Cunning Conqueror, and she was a commander from the Wilds of Eldraine precons, but the deck was not built around her specifically, so I think we're gonna do this wonderful queen a favor and build the deck around her ourselves. We've already built the Alayla that was in Esper colors before, and this is gonna be a much different take on what this commander does. She's currently 40 cents, and we've got the entire deck built for $15.45, as is tradition with the $15 decks, so hopefully you'll be able to afford this particular deck with its roguish strategy that we'll be getting into in just a moment. So Alayla Cunning Conqueror is a 4-mana 2/4 flyer that says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, you make a fairy rogue creature token, and it has flying. That's already enough of a fantastic ability. This means we're going to be using cantrips and counter spells and all kinds of interaction on other people's turns, and that's going to be far more important to us than playing cards on our turns. Usually. But there's a second part of Alayla's ability as well that we need to take a little bit of time to focus on. Alayla says, anytime one of our fairies deal combat damage to a player, we can goad a creature that player controls. Now, if you've ever played a goad deck, this can be a very fun mechanic, as it forces people to get into tussles they otherwise wouldn't want to. But unlike most goad decks, our deck won't suck. Because usually the problem that a goad deck runs into is, let's say that you and one player are left standing after 2 other players have had to slug it out and die due to your goad mechanic. That feels fine, but then you end up taking home the silver medal because now your goad effects don't work anymore. So because of this, we're not going to be focusing the deck so much on goad. Goad will be a benefit that we gain by playing our deck properly. And like I said before, 90% of the time we're going to be playing our deck on our opponent's turns. So to facilitate that, we've got a few cards that help us abuse our commander's ability, 3 in fact, and we're going to get into those before we get into other cards the deck may be running. Starting with Obira, Dreaming Duelist. This card has flash, so we can play it on an opponent's turn, triggering our commander's ability, and if another fairy we control enters the battlefield, then each opponent will lose 1 life. This means that we will always be burning our opponents and always be making an impact on the game, no matter if we are swinging or interacting with things or what have you. Obira is fantastic, and she may even be a wonderful commander to start somebody out with if they are learning the game for the first time. But that might be a video for another day. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Anywho, the next one would be Widen the Biting Gale. Now, she's got flash and flying, so of course she can trigger our commander's ability, but uniquely to Widen, she has the ability to bounce herself to our hand. This means if we are in a position where we cannot get our commander's trigger off of other cards, say we're mana flooded or it's late in the game and we're running out of spells in general, Widen gives us a repeatable way to use this to use our commander's effect. We should be holding up mana on our opponent's turns no matter what. I don't know what kind of just cocaine-fueled night of magic you're having if you have to tap all of your mana down every single turn, every time, playing all your cards on curve 120% of the time, and not holding up interaction and then wondering why you lost when somebody played an easily counterable spell. I don't know how many drugs you have to do to play those kinds of games of Magic, but if you are playing this deck correctly, you should always have mana that is held up and ready for Widen's ability. Then we have Butch Deloria, the Tunnel Snake. Now, Butch is not a fairy, but he is a rogue, and Alayla does make fairy rogues, and a lot of the fairies in our deck are also rogues, and whenever it attacks, it gets 1/1 for every single rogue or snake you control. We're not worried about the snake part. Not really. We can also pay 2 to put a menace counter on any creature and turn it into a rogue if it is not already a rogue. So Widen and Obira will become fairy rogues on top of their other effects thanks to Butch. We don't really need that effect all the time, but it is helpful to make sure that Butch will always get a little bigger if we need him to. He can get absolutely massive with our commander, and because he's got menace, he should help us clear a lot of board states. Oh, but wait, we might not have to worry about clearing board board states because our commander is making all of our opponent's creatures get goaded, so oftentimes our opponents won't even have blockers available to deal with Butch in the first place. He may be able to just run over somebody's life irrespective of what they have going on. But the next part of our core strategy is we need to supplement those fairies somehow. They can't just be 1/1s. So we've got Una, Queen of the Fae, as our deck's lieutenant to help with that. She could also be a commander in her own right if you really want to, but Una says that we can choose a color, and target opponent will exile the top X cards of their library, and for every card of the chosen color exiled this way, we'll make another blue and black fairy rogue creature token. Now, the cool thing about Una is you can use her effect at instant speed. So this is not just an effect we get to use to harm a player and just get some neat fairies out of it. We also can use this to stop tutor effects. Somebody plays Vampiric Tutor, puts a really important card on top of their library, and then we just use Una to get rid of that card. Somebody scries 3 and rearranges their deck. We use Una to get rid of those cards. Somebody's using a top deck manipulation deck and they just casted a Brainstorm. We can use Una to get rid of whatever they put on top of their deck. This is going to create a push and pull game with other players as they try to work around when we will or will not use Una to harm their strategies. And I think it's a very fun push and pull game to be a part of. So let's go ahead and get to the next part of the deck. We have more ways to supplement those fairy tokens, and that's by buffing their power and toughness. These are the lords and anthems of our deck, and they are mostly rogue focused. Soaring Thought Thief says as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, easy enough to manage in a game of Commander, all of your rogues get 1/0, and if one of your rogues attacks, then each opponent will mill 2 cards. So he will trigger his own effect. He's got Flash so that Alayla will see him and benefit from generating rogues with her effects, and just in general, Soaring Thought Thief is a fantastic card. Stink Drinker Bandit will give all of our rogues, which are also our fairies, 2/1, and he can cast for his prowl cost if we need him to. But honestly, even if we never cast him for the prowl cost, 4 mana for a 2/1 anthem to all of our creatures is not the worst rate of return. Silver Fur Master also gives our ninjas and rogues 1/1, and he's got ninjutsu, but you're not really needing him to do that. But you can fuck up somebody's math, for instance, if you need to. Let's say we swing at a player with, say, 10, a conservative amount of fairy tokens, and they choose their blockers accordingly so that they can live with, I don't know, 8 or 9 life. You can flip the Silver Fur Master on the board by getting rid of one of the fairy tokens with ninjutsu, and then suddenly all of your fairies are bigger and you've combat tricked your way into winning the game. That's an option that you have access to if you want to. So use it accordingly if you need to. Shadow Puppeteers says that it enters the battlefield making 2 other Black Fairy Rogue tokens with flying, and whenever one of those creatures attack, they become a 4/4 dragon with its other types and colors intact as well. So this is basically adding 3 power and 3 toughness to all of our fairy rogues when they are swinging. So that's an insane buff. Scion of Una gives all of our fairies 1/1, and of course it has Flash, so we can drop it on the board, generating another token with our commander. It also gives our fairies Shroud, so we can use this to protect our commander as well. Anawan the Ruin Thief gives all of our rogues 1/1, and if one of our rogues deals combat damage to a player, they mill a card for each 1 damage dealt to them, and then that can turn into draw power for us. Up to 3 draws a turn, because it is per opponent. Then we have Una's Blackguard, which gives all of our rogues 1/1 counters when they touch the board, and if they hit somebody with one of their 1/1 counters, then they force a player to discard a card from their hand. We can use this to effectively empty the hands of our opponents entirely, and Una's Blackguard is going to be a lightning rod for removal. She is an incredibly dangerous card in our deck. Then we have Tegwil, Duke of Splendor, and we're picking him to go into the 99 because we are focusing the deck on Alayla, but also Tegwil If he ends up getting too expensive in his paper form, remember that you can proxy him in your deck and just use the thick version of Tegwill as a shuffle-in proxy, letting people know, hey, I do have a copy of Tegwill. It is a legal copy of Tegwill. It is just too thick to be in the 99 of my deck, so I'm using a proxy. That's basically my policy with all of these thick cards, is that if their thick versions are under $1, they can go in the 99s of decks, because there is a way you can get them in your deck legally that nobody can really bitch about. But he's got Flying, Death Touch. He gives all fairies 1/1, and if one of your fairies die, you draw a card and lose 1 life. He's a neat draw engine for the deck on top of being a lord for all of your fairies. But he mentioned fairies dying. What do we do when some of those fairies die? Well, our fairies mostly are tokens, and we want to make sure that we get these really important pieces back to our hand or back on the board if we can. So Altar of Baal can get rid of our fairy tokens and turn them into our main creatures we just talked about again if we need to. We can also use Dread Return to reanimate any creature from our grave, or sack 3 of our fairy tokens to reanimate a creature without spending any mana if it's in the graveyard. Flashback's a wonderful effect. Then we've got Torrential Gearhulk, which is a super massive flash creature that will cast any of our instants, of which our deck has 28 mind, and that's just a really good card for our deck. I'm sorry. A 5/6 with flash is already a little much to throw at an opponent when they think they're going to win the game, but recasting one of those cards from our graveyard and just getting access to counter spells, removal spells, anything like that is just an insanely good thing to have on an effect like this. It's just having recursion in instant form is really, really good. And there are other things this deck is going to be doing, but we've got to move on to the next sections. Just understand, Torrential Gearhulk can give us draw power, removal, counter spells, anything at all. If you choose to upgrade the deck, I would highly recommend keeping the Torrential Gearhulk in, because he's always going to have value attached to what he is doing. But let's move on to the draw package to see how we're digging through our deck. So speaking about draw in this deck is kind of interesting, because draw almost takes over most of what this deck does. Being a play on our opponent's turn style of strategy, we always want to be casting cards during their turn. So to facilitate this, we have a ton of draw power that not only lets us dig through our deck, but can also be cast multiple times so as to be always useful when we're trying to trigger a Layla. Let's begin with Radical Idea, a cantrip that draws us 1 card and has Jumpstart, allowing us to cast it from our graveyard by discarding a card. Very, very simple, and most of the cards in this category are going to be very close to this effect. Catalog draws us 2 cards and then discards us a card. Think Twice draws us a card and then has flashback, so we can cast it again from the graveyard. Dihada's Ploy has Jumpstart. It lets us draw 2 cards and discard a card, then gaining life equal to the number of cards we've discarded this turn. So I actually really, really like Dihada's Ploy. I'm just not gonna lie. I have this in more than just this deck. Kempster's Insight draws us 2 cards, and of course it has Jump Start, so we can use it on other players' turns more than once. Una's Grace draws us a card with Retrace, so we can use it again from the graveyard by discarding a land in addition to its other costs. Retrace, notably, is repeatable, so we can use this as many times as we need. Opt draws us a card after scrying 1. Factor Fiction reveals the top 5 of our library, and then we make an opponent separate them into piles and play a Faustin bargain game with us, where we will always be the one that benefits. Nimrus Una's Trickster benefits as well from all the cards we're forcing ourselves to cast on our opponent's turns, because every time we cast a spell during an opponent's turn, we look at the top 2 cards of our library, put one of them into our hand and the other into our graveyard. So this card draws us through our deck very quickly if we have it on the board with our commander. Dig Through Time has Delve, so we can use our spent cards in the grave that don't have Retrace or Jumpstart to lower its cost, and it lets us look at the top 7 cards of our library and put 2 of them into our hand. The fact that this card is only 18 cents now is absurd, but I'll take it. Quick Study draws us 2 cards, and Blood Pact makes us lose 2 life and draws us 2 cards for the same cost. Then we've got Blightwing Bandit. It's got Flying and Death Touch, and whenever we cast our first spell during an opponent's turn, we can look at the top card of their library, then exile it face down and play that card for as long as it remains Exile. This is less draw and more thieving, but it is giving us more spells to cast whenever we are casting our stuff. Military Intelligence will draw us a card every time we attack with 2 or more creatures, which is really easy to do with all the fairies we're playing. Wave Break Hippocamp will draw us a card when we cast our first spell during an opponent's turn. Reconnaissance Mission will draw us a card whenever our fairies make impact with our opponent's noggins. Bident of Thassa is doing the same while also giving us an extra way of forcing our opponents to have goaded creatures. And then Memory Deluge lets us look at the top X cards of our library, where X is the mana we drop into it, and then get 2 of those cards and put them into our hand. Of course, it's going to give us one of the top 4 cards and then one of the top 7 cards after we flash it back, and flashing it back does mean we have easy access to recurring our commander's ability. Every single one of these cards is going to help us dig through our deck very, very quickly, and the most important thing is making sure that if you are building your own version of this deck, make sure that all of your draw is either very, very repeatable, benefits off your commander's ability, or otherwise is at instant speed, so that no matter what, you can trigger her ability and generate even more fairy tokens. This next section is also going to be rather thick because we are wanting to play on our opponent's turns. And what's better to do on our opponent's turn than removing all of their shit? So we've got Reckless Spite as one of the 19 removal and interaction pieces in this deck. Reckless Spite destroys 2 target non-black creatures, and we lose 5 life for the benefit of that. Spell Snuff can counter any spell, and if we have 5 or less life, we can draw a card when we use it. Exclude counters a spell and then draws us a card. Oh boy, getting a lot of draw on this deck is really easy. Artistic Refusal can draw us 2 cards and discard a card while also countering a spell, and it's got Convoke, which is super easy to pay for with all the tokens that we're generating. Power Word Kill can kill one of any type of creature except an angel, demon, devil, or dragon. Hypnotic Sprite can counter any spell with mana value 3 or less, while also being a fairy we can play in its own right afterwards. Essence Capture can counter a creature spell, then put a 1/1 counter on one of our fairies. Spell Stutter counters a spell unless they pay 2 and then 1 for every fairy we control. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. Negate can counter any non-creature spell. Bane's Contingency can counter a spell, then scry 2 and draw us a card if that spell targeted our commander. Disruption Protocol can counter any spell, and then it can cost 1 less if we tap one of our 12 artifacts. Pile On has Convoke, so we can drop its cost down to nothing. It lets us destroy a creature or planeswalker and then surveil 2. Heartless Act can blow up a creature that has no counters, or it can get rid of 3 counters that are on a creature. With the amount of stuff that's adding like flying counters and death touch counters and all kinds of neat stuff in Modern Horizons 3, this can just get rid of a creature or get rid of some of its fun toys if you want to be more politicky. Then we've got Poison the Cup, blow up a creature. If this spell was foretold, scry 2 as well. It's just murder with extra steps, really. Dismiss can counter any spell for 4 mana, bit overcosted, but it also lets us draw 1, which is important for our deck. Sapphire Dragon can counter any non-creature spell for 3, so it's a negate for 3 instead of 2, but it also allows us to summon itself as a giant dragon that's a 5/6 and scries 2 every time it attacks or blocks. Dimir Charm can counter a sorcery spell or blow up a creature with power 2 or less, or it can look at 3 cards and put 1 back and the rest in the player's graveyard. Again, use cards like this to stop people from using Vampiric Tutor. Super simple, very powerful though. Rankle gives us repeatable access to draw and also sacrifice and also discard for our opponents, while being a fairy rogue with haste in his own right. And Wash Away gives us a counter spell that can also counter any commander if we are willing to pay 1 mana instead of 3. Honestly, reasonable rate of return for cucking somebody from their first commander of the game. While our deck doesn't have the most massive of mana curves, we do still need to make sure that we have a responsible amount of ramp in the package so that we can cast our few bigger spells on curve when we can. So we've got 11 ramp pieces in the deck, beginning with Charcoal and Sky Diamond. Basic ass ramp that I try to include in just about every budget deck because they are nice, clean, fair, 2 mana, and holy crap, I adore these things. I feel like that might be something special interest. I don't know, but I've always really liked the diamonds. Honored Heirloom is the rainbow rock that goes in every deck, because Honored Heirloom is a 3 mana rock that lets us exile a card from any player's graveyard if we need it. We're already holding up mana on our opponent's turns all the time anyway, so you should be able to hold up the mana for this. I saw somebody in a comment tell me that Honored Heirloom was bad because paying 5 mana effectively to get rid of one card in a graveyard is a bad rate of return, and I would agree if that's how the fuck the card worked. Turns out it's a mana rock 99% of the time, and then when somebody's playing a Marin of Clan Nel Toth deck or cast their Reanimate, you get to trip them up by getting rid of one of their cards with the mana you should be holding up anyway for interaction during a normal game of Magic already. Like, it's a mana rock 90% of the time, and then 1% of the time it's a way to tell the reanimation player to fuck off and die. Like, I'm sorry, but I feel like people who disagree with me on Honored Heirloom are just playing Magic the Gathering incorrectly. I'm sorry, I can't think of it any other way besides just being wrong at card game. Then we have Dreamscape Artist, which lets us discard a card to sack a land to put 2 lands from our deck onto the battlefield untapped. So, dude, blue has untapped land ramp. Never forget. Dimir Signet lets us tap it to get a Dimir set of land as long as we filter mana into it. Wayfarer's Bauble can get any basic land from our deck onto the battlefield. Prosperous Thief says whenever one or more ninja or rogues deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. Again, this triggers 3 times a turn with our commander, so 3 treasures every single turn with an anime waifu stealing fish. Then we have Mind Stone, which can draw us a card if we need it to, but otherwise is a 2 mana rock that we can just drop down freely. Arcane Signet is a 2 mana rock that adds a mana of any of our commander's identity colors. And then we have Victory Chimes, which gives us a 3 mana rock that untaps every player's untapped step. Because again, those of you who don't like 3 mana rocks are insane, and I don't know why you don't like all this added utility. It's crazy that you guys don't like enjoying the card game you claim to enjoy, and are instead worried about hyper efficiency in the face of what? Your friends? Is that really what? Is that really what you need to do? Choose fun. Pick 3 mana rocks. They always do nutty shit, like this one that always untaps during every player's turn. In our deck, this is effectively a 3 mana rock that gives 4 mana. This is a Thran Dynamo, but more and bigger and stronger and amazing and spread across multiple turns as far as our deck is concerned. Heraldic Banner is another 3 mana rock that makes all of our creatures of a chosen color, so in our case, whatever color our fairy tokens happen to be, gives them all 1/0 while also being a mana rock. More Lords? It's a Lord that's also a mana rock? Again, 3 mana rocks are insanely good. You just hate liking fun things. Sorry, I'm very, very passionate about the fact that I think modular cards are really good, and not just the modular creatures that are part of the Hardened Scales deck. Not that kind of modular, but also that kind of modular. Anyway, lands is the next thing we got to go over. We got some dual lands in this deck, beginning with Secluded Glen. Enters the battlefield, we can reveal a fairy from our hand, and if we don't, it comes into the battlefield tapped. We've got a fair few fairies in our deck, as we are a fairy deck, so perfectly reasonable. Sunken Hollow comes into play untapped if we have 2 or more basic lands. Exotic Orchard is whatever lands our opponents are currently playing. Choked Estuary lets us reveal an island or a swamp from our hand. Otherwise, it comes into play tapped. Tainted Isle comes into play untapped, and it gives us mana of both of our deck's colors if we have a swamp. Command Tower is just both of our deck's colors all the time. Darkwater Catacomb is a filter land for our deck's colors, which again, I don't know why people hate these things. Dimir Aqueduct lets us bounce utility lands to our hand to reuse them while giving us access to 2 colors if we need it. Fetid Pool is a searchable cycling land in our deck's colors, and River of Tears can be one of our deck's colors if we haven't played a land this turn, and the other one if we have played a land this turn. Then we've got Fetching Lands, Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, and both of these just crack and get our deck's colors onto the battlefield. Promising Vein, Shire Terrace, Grixis Panorama, and Esper Panorama are all the same card in our deck. They come into play untapped, and we can sack them to get any of the basic lands our deck has onto the battlefield. Myriad Landscape does similar things, but it comes into play tapped, and it ramps those lands onto the battlefield. And then we've got Pit of Offerings as a utility land. We can't fit Bojuka Bog in our budget, but we can use this as a Bojuka Bog at home. Gets rid of any 3 cards in any combination of graveyards. It can tap for the colors of the cards it gets rid of, and it's fantastic. And again, if you need to use it more than once, you can bounce it to your hand with Dimir Aqueduct. After that, we've got 11 islands and 6 swamps, as we do favor blue a lot more in this deck with all the draw it is running. And that does it for the main meat of the deck. And hopefully, you should be able to pilot it on your opponent's turns most of the time. But we're not done yet, because what if you have a bit of a budget that you want to throw into this thing? If you decided to take this deck a little bit further, these are some upgrades that I would pick. There's about $80 worth of upgrades here in total, so it's still technically a budget deck by somebody's standards if you were to add a bunch of this stuff in. But let's begin with one of the cheaper ones. This is Feywild Visitor. Commander creatures you control have the ability to generate fairy dragon creature tokens when they punch. If you decided to side grade the deck into more of a fairy and less of a rogue deck, this would supplement the commander quite well. Then we've got Waterlogged Teachings, which is an instant cast tutor for another instant, or a card with flash, which our deck has a lot of, and it's an MDFC, so it is a land on the back side for 53 cents. For 65 cents, you could add Pact of the Serpent in, which gives you a super draw if you need, or the ability to burn a player to death based on the amount of fairies or rogues you've got. Drown in the Loch is almost $1, and it's a counterspell or a kill spell. Bojuka Bog being a land that lets you blow up a player's graveyard. Fel the Profane is an MDFC as well that lets you blow up a creature if you need. Malleable Imposter is a fairy clone that can be played on your opponent's turn, which you certainly can find some uses for. Hagar Mauling is another MDFC that can blow up a creature. Basic Old Counterspell will be a good upgrade to get rid of one of your higher costed counterspells. Sink and Stupor would be a nice side grade for one of them because it is an MDFC. Malakir Rebirth is a great way to protect our commander since we can just have it survive board wipes with this, and it's an MDFC. Arcane Denial is a counterspell that lets us draw cards. Hullbreaker Horror, for all the cards we are casting at instant speed on our opponent's turn, we can use this to effectively turn them all into copies of Remand. Kindred Dominance is a way to wipe the board of everything except whatever type of card we want to keep, usually fairies or rogues. Kindred Discovery will let us choose a creature type, and anytime one of those creatures attacks or hops on the battlefield, we get to draw a card. Be careful with this. In this deck, this card could just make you deck out ridiculously quickly, so be very, very careful. Spellstutter Sprite would be another wonderful counter spell to add to the deck while also being a fairy. Then we've got Skull Clamp, a more controllable way to draw lots of cards in the deck. 3 Steps Ahead is a counter spell that can also make token copies of things or draws cards and discard cards. I have found that in the decks I've included it in, it is an overperformer because of the choices that I get to have with it. Then we have Cryptic Command, another modal card that lets us counter a spell and draw a card if we need. It's got other modes, but most of the time it's just going to be those two as far as I'm concerned. Gifts of the Hellraiser lets us get rogues that are zombies for every single time that we just counter a spell, basically. She says anytime you do a crime, you get to generate those rogues once a turn, which is the rate we're trying to go with our commander anyway, so she would be a nice supplementary lieutenant. Then we have Dire Undercurrents, which says if a blue creature touches the board, we can draw a card, and if a black creature touches the board, we can make somebody discard a card. Unlike Kindred Discovery, Dire Undercurrents is a choice, and there is a $3 printing of it available now thanks to Secret Lair. Fairy Mastermind has flash and comes onto the board on our opponent's turns, which is what our commander wants. And every time our opponent draws a second card during their turn, we can just draw a card alongside them. We can also pay 4 mana to force every player to draw a card. So there are situations where we can wait until the player whose turn is about to end and transition to our turn is doing their thing. When they're about to end their turn, if we have enough open mana, we can actually use FAERIE Mastermind twice, making all of our opponents draw 2 cards, generating us 2 cards from his effect, and then 3 cards from our opponent's drawing cards as well. Or, you know, anytime we use his draw effect, we're going to draw a card anyway because one opponent has already drawn a card for their draw phase. Honestly, the Mastermind's a great group huggy card, but he's also really cool in our deck because we should usually have all of the interaction we need to deal with whatever we hand our opponents. And then the 2 big boys of the deck in terms of cost are Bitter Blossom, giving us an easy access to a Black Fairy Rogue every single time our turn begins, and then Coat of Arms, which says that we get 1/1 for every creature that shares a type with another creature. All creatures gain that. So if there's another Kindred deck at the battlefield, then we suffer. But generally speaking, we should have the most creatures on the battlefield with how our commander is built, so Coat of Arms will usually be generating a lot of power for them. This basically creates a lethal board of fairies after 2 turn cycles, so just build up a board of 4 fairies or 3 fairies a turn cycle, and then if you've got your 6 or 9 fairies after turn cycle 2 or 3, once you've got all those on the board, cast the Coat of Arms. Now all the fairies are 10/10s, and you should be lethaling the entire table at that point. Because if people haven't done damage already, then, I mean, hell, what are they doing? You've got other ways of doing damage as well. Coat of Arms is a giant game-winning card in most circumstances in our deck. In conclusion, Alayla Cunning Conqueror is a fantastic commander that generates a lot of fairy tokens and makes our opponents fight amongst themselves instead of fighting us. If you want a wonderful fairy commander, then I highly suggest picking her up at the whopping 40 cents that she's at. The deck is available in the description. I don't get any kickback or anything from that because TCG Player refused to sponsor me. I don't know why. Could be the tits. Who knows? But anywho, Alayla is available if you have not played her yet. If you've already picked up that Fairy Precon and you've been trying to figure out what to do with it, or your LGS just happens to have one of these sitting in a binder, pick it up, see if you've got a bunch of the cards from this set already, see if you've got everything that I've listed here, or, you know, whatever you happen to have lying around, throw her together and let me know what you think. I think as long as you keep the deck to having mostly cards that are played at flash or instant speed, the deck should work perfectly fine, no matter how you build it. But make sure to keep your mana curve as low as you can so you can interact on everybody's turn without having to worry too much about the kickback from that. But that all said, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I think you're going to have fun with the deck, honestly, but I leave that up to you to decide if you decide to pick up this thing, and let me know in the comments how it plays out for you. If you decide to use the Moxfield list I've provided in order to play on Spell Table with Moxfield's playtest thing, then you can do that as well. Either way, let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank every single one of you for watching these videos. We are gaining subscribers at a much more rapid rate than I thought I was going to, and it's for something that started out as a secondary channel, my second secondary channel that I've made. This is very rapidly becoming a passion of mine to just keep on pumping out content for. So as long as y'all are here to watch it, I will be doing everything in my power to produce it. Let me know if you're enjoying it and what improvements I could make to these videos. But with that all said, guys, as always, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here. They would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.